and them have to go hand in hand. They tell you that these are fraudulent claims because they feel that they're being told to pay too much, and they're blaming the courts for believing these fraudulent claims. So it makes absolutely no sense where they're coming from. But yet when you press that industry, and there was questions asked to the industry of like, well, from time to time, consumers would tell us they've had a crack in the windshield. And so you go to get it repaired, and the people within that industry, well, the first question they'll ask you is this an insurance job, so to speak, or are you paying for it out of your own pocket? And as soon as you say it's an insurance, the claim, and I'm probably wrong in my numbers, but just by way of difference, they'll say the job will jump from a personal responsibility of $300 to $400 to $600 to $700 if it's an insurance case. So why wouldn't the insurance company go after these fraudulent people? Why isn't the government, if this fraud is going on, and it's, if it costs $300 for me to have a windshield replaced, it should cost the insurance company the same. I believe that. I believe in honesty and fairness. So if that's going on, why aren't they going on out there? What really stand of way is the insurance industry itself doing to police such things as automobile repairs? There's, you must go out and get quotes and so on, but there's at the end of the day, there doesn't appear to be anybody in IBC or any other associated companies like cooperators who happen to be outside of IBC, what they've done to pursue this matter and to bring some clarity to it and to make sure that this is going to stop. But no, Mr. Speaker, they instead of policing themselves, have come to this House and said this is what we need, and this government is complying with it. This government is saying, we agree with you. We'll put caps on the consumer's ability. Their basic human rights will take it away because we're going to cap it, and therefore their access to the courts, similar to most others in this province, will be abrogated, and we find that completely reasonable. We find that reasonable to do. We find it reasonable that we should make a benchmark for you of a 10% return on investment. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's not many people in this province have that type of guarantee. There's our seniors don't have the ability of having a guaranteed 10% return on their investment. But for some reason, this government seems to be in compliance with the insurance industry to say, for you to operate in a reasonable way, you need 10% increase. Could you imagine if we said that every year we will allow a 10% increase in protection for people that are on income assistance from community services? There'd be a great howl about that. The poorest of the poor, Mr. Speaker. What if we said that, yes, every year the minimum wage will increase by 10%? There'd be howls from every sector, Mr. Speaker. Not from this side, I tell you, Mr. Speaker, but from people like the insurance industry, like the Insurance Bureau of Canada, will say, oh, no, that's not fair. But these people who have no economic ties to this province are coming here and telling us it's reasonable, more than reasonable in their estimation. It's a duty of this House to allow them to continue to make a profit of 10%, at least, at a minimum, 10% a year, while they're offshore enjoying these increases, Mr. Speaker. So what does Bill 1 say about that? Well, it really says nothing. Absolutely nothing on that, Mr. Speaker. So now what we have to do is say, I guess, why are we here? Are we here because there's a philosophical difference between the New Democrats and the Progressive Conservatives when it comes to insurance. Obviously, that goes almost without saying, but I think it deserves to be said nonetheless. It sounds much like a contradiction, but it does. I mean, we've gone through an election. We've put our case towards the electorate of this province, and I've heard argued previously that it was a referendum on insurance, and we lost. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, it was a referendum, if you will, on many facets. And, if indeed that maybe in another bill that will be coming forward at another time, that the government is asking the electorate of Nova Scotia to involve themselves in a plebiscite on maybe Sunday shopping, and they're willing to go that route. Well, I guess that then starts that slow decline of well, what do we reserve referendums or plebiscites for? And indeed, if we want to go back and argue that point, that there was in August a referendum on public auto, I would say no, and I would say if the government is certainly willing to look at putting Sunday shopping to that test, I would dare say that public auto is much closer to the hearts of the consumers of Nova Scotia, whether they can buy that or whether they can buy a shirt on Sunday. I think that would be a much more diligent question to ask the electorate of Nova Scotia. But indeed, in fact, the recent provincial election was not a referendum on public auto, but it was indeed a referendum on government. And so, for people to say your party did not become government, therefore the citizens of Nova Scotia do not want public auto is wrong and misleading, to say the least, Mr. Speaker. So I think those type of questions aren't answered that easily. It's, again, as I say to you, it's about our philosophy of how consumers should be treated when it comes to purchasing their automobile insurance, Mr. Speaker. So, another area that really Bill 1 doesn't come within a country mile of assessing is the Facility Association. Now, it's, if you listen to the insurance industry talk to you about the Facility Association, you would think it's this marvelous cooperative out there that they look after consumers. Well, it's not. It's a fund where they pool their money and put people in after so many accidents. But there indeed lies one of the problems, Speaker, is that what constitutes you getting into facility and getting out? Like in basic terms, new male drivers under the age of 25 invariably end up in facility-like numbers. Now, Bill 1 talks about non-discrimination, but really does not go into any great length of describing how young male drivers are going to be protected from that. As a matter of fact, the industry itself wanted to expand facility to bring more people under facility. And so therefore it would cost many more thousands of dollars to be insured. So, and not only that, it certainly would allow people to stay there longer, and indeed that I would believe it would make it even harder for people to get out of facility. That if I asked you as a consumer, Mr. Speaker, with a young family, or yourself, if you have been unfortunate enough to be in a few accidents, what's your time frame in facility and how do you get out? Well, most consumers can't tell you. But this is nothing about, there's nothing in this bill about making that open. There's nothing in this bill about allowing consumers to see where they're going. So we have this facility association that's causing quite a few people to be left in facility for periods well beyond the time frame they should be in there. well beyond the time frame, Mr. Speaker, yet the government is not addressing that in any way, shape, or form in Bill 1. So we're here, and we're being told that this is a bill primarily to look after consumers. So, primarily to look after insurance industry. It's not to look after the consumers, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at another section that really, for its complexity about, and again, I think this is probably more so when you talk about this kind of abstract definition they have of minor injury. But let's before we get too far into that, let's talk about Section B of your insurance policy, because again, the only part it really tells you about Section B is, and that's the part where you get coverage for injuries and so on, Mr. Speaker, is where's it at? Where's the meat here in Section B? There's really none. What it tells already hard-strapped consumers, it tells that if you want to buy extra coverage under Section B, then we'll let you. But that's all. So what it is, it's another cost to consumers. So it's another part of that legislated 20% that's being caught up here. I'm reminded when I think of trying to get back to the fact that this government will look after people if they're harmed and they feel that they've been hard done by the insurance company, that they will be, there's a grievance procedure, if you will, in place. Well, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect to the minister putting this forward, to the government, how long is this going to take? There's no limit on the investigation. If the insurance company comes out and says, we are going to charge you $1,000 this year where we charged you $200 last year, so what happens? At what point is there, what timely mechanism is put in place here that would evolve and allow this to be handled in a timely manner? What we see here is the minister setting up a parallel URB process as opposed to any kind of reform process. So what you have to do then is you go and it's baffling from a government that tells us on one day that we don't believe in public auto. But boy, oh boy, when it comes to appointing maybe some of our friends to a board to review this, we're all for it. So what we have now is a board that we don't know. This is all going to be done by OIC, so we don't know. So this is all going to be there, and these people are going to have all this jurisdiction over insurance. So we don't know how, we don't know what timely manner. There's nothing in any of the regulations that says that they'll, from step one, when a complaint is filed, to the final step of how long this will take. And what do we have on the other side? We have clear mandates set out on the amount of fines if you're caught driving while uninsured. Well, Mr. Speaker, often by itself, insuring people that aren't, or fining people that aren't insured is not really, I don't find that offensive to me, because we're talking about the public safety. But what it seems to be is the bill is considerably two-faced here, when it clearly lies out what your penalty will be if you operate a motor vehicle and do not have the proper insurance on it. But when you try to get that insurance and you have a disagreement with the carrier, it doesn't seem to be, there's no real resolve there. So what it is we've set up the mechanism that will punish the consumer, but we have not set up a mechanism that will really clearly tell us which way we're going to do to make sure that the insurance companies stand and toe the mark. So what are we going to do here? It absolutely makes no sense, Mr. Speaker. When I stood up on Tuesday I followed the member from the third party who spent a great deal of his time saying what was wrong with our position. Now, I did not expect their party to support public auto. I mean, this is a party that clearly said that they're willing to hand over our public education to private interests in three-piece schools, Mr. Speaker. This is the same party that gave away our offshore. So they don't feel anything in the public interest. So, you know, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, and I don't feel that there's a need to, because it was a third-party rant that really I felt was, well, I just considered the source. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that does not protect the consumers of this province. This is a bill that protects the insurance industry. This is a bill that in 6 months hence will be shown for what it really is. It's a piece of legislation that's a reaction to a government that almost fell in New Brunswick, a government that almost fell here in Nova Scotia, a government that ignored it in Prince Edward Island, a government that's fighting it now in Newfoundland. And the reality is, until we realize that the fairest and best way to treat the insurance automobile consumers of this province and of this country is with a driver-owned public system, that is the way to do it. This bill does not do that. This bill just, in the end of the day, addresses the concerns of the automobile insurance industry and not the consumers. Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the people in this province that they're the people that we owe something to, not the people in The Hague, not the people in Bristol, England, Mr. Speaker. This bill does nothing for our people, Nova Scotians, that we are sworn to serve. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party, resuming debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise and speak on Bill 1, the insurance bill. And before I do, I want to first recognize the outstanding effort that was done by the people in our staff to help research this area and provide us with the level of support that we need. I think we all recognize that the insurance question is not a particularly straightforward one, and all caucuses are receiving a great deal of assistance and help from their staffs, and certainly I want to recognize the effort that's been put in by our team to ensure that there is a proper level of understanding with respect to this. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had a conversation with the Premier in advance of my remarks today and in advance of releasing a press release concerning the insurance bill, because I wanted him to know that it is our overall intention to try to make this minority situation work. And it is our overall intention to try to make this bill work. However, as it stands right now, we see this bill as having serious flaws. Flaws that I hope will be able to be reconciled with discussions with the government and also through law amendments. We're looking forward to the opportunity for Nova Scotians to come forward and provide their comments about what exists in this legislation and how they're going to be affected. It was the Liberal Party that provided some leadership about a year and a half ago, Mr. Speaker. It was the Liberal Party that said that rather than slough this matter off to the URB, we should deal with it in the House. That happened at a time when I was not the leader of this party, but I think in hindsight we recognize the wisdom of providing some clear leadership on this matter from an early stage. A year ago, I appeared before the URB when those hearings were ultimately called. And at that time, we spoke about the need for us to have a permanent consumer's advocate. We spoke about the pressing problems that existed for many seniors in Nova Scotia and also for young people as well. We spoke again about the need for us to provide leadership. We didn't stick our heads in the sand and say, perhaps someday a solution will suddenly appear. We didn't rely on the old dogma that came from the NDP, who relied on a national policy that's been well established for a long period of time. That same policy that was presented by Bob Rae, Premier of Ontario, some long time ago.
Where's he at?
Bob Rae campaigned on public auto insurance, Mr. Speaker, and at that time, he, like this new Democratic Party, came forward and suggested that it's the best thing for the people of Ontario. But when the rubber hit the road, when the pragmatism of public auto insurance, the unworkability of it was examined by the Rae government, it was clear to them that it was not ultimately workable. We have other suggestions as well. There are many references by the New Democrats to the 3 Western provinces that provide government insurance. That's of some interest. And unfortunately for many Nova Scotians, this notion that all 3 provinces in the western part of this country that provide public insurance are in fact the same, but they aren't. We have a province in Saskatchewan and Manitoba that are dominated by a no-fault system. Now, the New Democrats oppose a no-fault system. They are squarely and utterly opposed to a no-fault system. However, how many Nova Scotians understand it when this party continues to refer to public insurance and Manitoba and Saskatchewan's model? They have yet to come clean to the people of Nova Scotia and say unequivocally that it is not possible to model Saskatchewan and Manitoba because the NDP are opposed to the position of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They are saying Mr. Speaker, they are saying squarely that they are against a no-fault system. How frustrated must it be for Nova Scotians to continue to hear that party speak about public insurance from Saskatchewan and Manitoba when they are opposed to the Saskatchewan and Manitoba models? The only comparable system is clearly the British Columbia system. We know about the problems with respect to British Columbia. We've seen it over and over, the multi-million-dollar bailouts that they've received from time to time. And perhaps most troubling of all is that in Nova Scotia, we have the benefit that they haven't had in New Brunswick. We have had the URB listen to expert testimony, listen to the testimony of Nova Scotians about what the problem is here in Nova Scotia. They said that the problem related to the intensity of the claims that people were receiving. Undaunted by this, however, the NDP continued on its track, the dogmatic track of trying to ensure that government has all the answers for all the people all the time. Let's just provide a public response whenever there's an opportunity to step on the foot of the private sector. Right. This party is committed to a private sector solution. We believe that it can work. But we recognize that it hasn't been working effectively for some period of time. What has been required is leadership. Madam Speaker, leadership is what this party has provided. There has been only one party that has provided clear leadership. It happened back at the end of May of this year when we came forward with one plan, a single plan that hasn't changed. And what's been interesting about that is that gradually in New Brunswick and with respect to the government, everyone seems to be coming toward the solutions that the Liberal Party in Nova Scotia presented to people back in late May of last year. We won't rest on our laurels, Madam Speaker. We will try to make this bill even better. What we identified when we spoke about the insurance plan that we were coming forward with is that we need to provide a cap on soft tissue injuries. We weren't going to dilly-dally. First, for example, with respect to the government, I would say that there's the URB dodge that first came. There was the Consumer's Guide, which resulted in no fix. There was the Consumer's Advocate, who after being appointed was made redundant. Then there was the freeze on rates that appeared to have no particular effect. Then there was the appointment of an actuary who seemed to simply photocopy the work she and others may have done in New Brunswick on an earlier date. What we have and what we need ultimately is a made in Nova Scotia solution. Hear, hear. When the bill was tabled last Friday, it was encouraging for our party to see that the government has responded to our call for an across-the-board reduction for all consumers in Nova Scotia, because we see that as the only way in which we can put money into the pockets of Nova Scotians. But we were troubled, Madam Speaker, by other things. First and foremost, we were troubled by the definition that's been provided under this legislation. Secondly, we were troubled and frankly surprised at the extent to which this legislation cuts into economic loss. Back during the election campaign, the Premier was asked for his comments with respect to what the definition of minor injury might have meant. Minor injury is the term that's been used by the Conservatives since the beginning of their plan. When asked and pressed to give an example of what a minor injury meant, the Premier responded that it may involve muscle pain that gets better. And according to a press report, he emphasized that the cap would only be on pain and suffering for that kind of injury and not on compensation for economic loss. The industry, for its benefit, provides a newspaper advertisement that appears almost daily these days. Under thoughtful legislation, it says that Nova Scotians need thoughtful legislation that would introduce new regulations to limit compensation for minor soft tissue injuries while ensuring maximum benefits for the seriously injured. Minor soft tissue injuries. And it's clear from the position that they were taking before the URB that it was minor soft injury concerns that they were speaking about when they spoke about the problem of rapidly rising insurance rates here in Nova Scotia. When the bill appeared, Madam Speaker, we find that the definition was photocopied from other jurisdictions. And it says, it's very broad. It says that a minor injury is an injury that does not result in a permanent serious disfigurement or a permanent serious impairment of an important bodily function caused by a continuing injury which is physical in nature. It goes on to say that serious impairment means an impairment that causes substantial interference with a person's ability to perform their usual daily activities or their regular employment. Now, you won't find very often, Madam Speaker, that I associate myself with the comments of a member of the New Democratic Party, Mr. Steele, with respect to this. But on this occasion, frankly, I did hear his comments about whether or not when somebody were to hypothetically break every bone in their body, would it or would it not constitute a minor injury? And I heard the response from the minister responsible for insurance on the government side that he thought that this was essentially ludicrous. And I understand that to the example that I provided earlier today about somebody having 2 broken legs and being in a coma for 6 months, that under this legislation is considered a minor injury. He thought that this was silly. But Madam Speaker, I would invite him to read his own legislation in these circumstances. Because what does serious mean? And what does permanent mean? If we had somebody with 2 broken legs and they're in a coma for 6 months, they recover more or less fully. It's not a permanent injury. And therefore, it doesn't qualify as a minor injury under this legislation. And therefore, those people in those kinds of circumstances would find themselves with a check when they wake up for $2,500. That is not what this was intended. And I hope that it wasn't what was intended when these remarks were made by the government when they were looking to curry favor with Nova Scotia voters. It is unacceptable that this be put forward. What we always contemplated was a cap on soft tissue injuries. We did not contemplate such a significant interference with people's opportunity to recover for something that they are legitimately entitled to. This is not in the spirit of what was intended when the voters of Nova Scotia went to the polls on August 5th, and it will be the Liberal Party that makes sure that the government that earned government is held accountable for the comments that they made in the lead up to the election, and that a minor injury is truly a minor injury. That's what the industry was asking for, and that is what we will insist on. This reminds me, Your Honor, when one reads this definition and sees that something needs to be both permanent and serious for it to not be captured by the definition of minor injury, one is reminded of the Black Knight scene in the Holy Grail, where after losing a limb, the Black Knight says, "'Tis but a scratch." And then when losing another limb, the famous line was, "Just a flesh wound." Well, those aren't just flesh wounds. Those are things that, if they were to happen to Nova Scotians, would cut right into the operation of a family. And we need to recognize that in these circumstances, Nova Scotians deserve reasonable compensation for reasonable injuries. That's a history that has been built up for a long period of time. Now, it's not just the definition under this legislation that gives us some trouble, Madam Speaker. What surprised us most was that when we opened up this legislation, we saw that there were significant savings to be incurred by the industry with respect to economic loss. For a long time, there has been litigation in the courts of Nova Scotia and in the Supreme Court of Canada about the collateral benefit rule. The industry wanted to wipe it out. It wasn't, but it seems that this legislation does wipe it out. It ensures that consumers receive less, the industry keeps more in their pocket. We also have a provision whereby under this legislation, income tax reductions will not be provided. The compensation to injured drivers will be minus income tax and other benefits. That, again, results in a benefit to the insurance companies and not to the injured driver. We have in Nova Scotia a tradition under our common law for sick leave benefits to be paid for by the insurance company of the delinquent party who is driving. Under the new legislation, we see the sick leave benefits have been wiped out. We have recently established a homemaker housekeeping benefit that would flow to and recognize the significant benefit that comes to a family and the significant loss that happens to a family when a homemaker loses their ability to provide care to the home. Again, under this legislation, it appears that that is lost again. One might expect that LTD costs may go up because, again, under these provisions, the disability insurer is now carrying the loss of income burdens instead of the auto insurer. We have a two-tiered system with respect to Section B benefits. Under Section B, we now have a provision that suggests that if somebody can afford it, they can buy enhanced Section B benefits. In at least 50% of those occasions, the benefit for having bought those Section B benefits, the enhanced medical benefits, is going to flow to the insurance company once again. So when we contemplated whether or not this legislation was going to cut into economic losses, clearly, this was not what Nova Scotians had bargained for. This cuts into the benefits that Nova Scotians thought that they weren't going to be sacrificing when they cast their vote on August 5th. We remain hopeful that something ultimately will work. The definition under this legislation is the most troubling aspect, Madam Speaker. The definition drives the support that injured workers ultimately receive. If we have a definition that effectively wipes out the opportunity for people who have been seriously injured to retain and instruct counsel, then where does it leave them? It leaves them without the opportunity to have an advocate, not just with respect to their Section A benefits, their personal injury benefits, the pain and suffering, but also it creates the possibility that they won't have an advocate for their substantial and important Section B benefits. If most of the people who have been injured in a car accident in Nova Scotia are going to be compensated just for $2,500, then you can be certain that most of the people who have been injured in a car accident, almost all of them, will not be able to retain and instruct counsel. So they will not have somebody on their side to say, your loss of income recovery should be greater. Your medical benefits should be greater. It cuts out entirely the important role that advocates play on behalf of injured workers. So where does that leave us at the end of the day? It leaves us with something that ultimately needs amendment. We remain committed, ultimately, to a private sector solution. But in order for that private sector solution to work, there needs to be some compromise. And without compromise, this legislation ultimately will fail. This may be the most significant early test for this minority government. Our party wants to make it work in the interests of all Nova Scotians. Many Nova Scotians won't care about all the fine details that we discuss in the back rooms and perhaps in law amendments. What they care about is that they get reasonable compensation for reasonable rates. Hopefully, many of them will be appearing before the law amendments to hear Bill 1. I look forward to their comments. Our party looks forward to a constructive discussion with the government to ensure that the balance that is needed is ultimately there. We feel that we have the foundations for something that is ultimately workable. But in order for that to happen, compromise is necessary. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Well, I listened intently to the Leader of the Liberal Party and his comments. I note that he spent a great deal of time on our plan as opposed to on the government's plan or on their own plan. But I want to say, Madam Speaker, that if there is one absolute truth in this House, it's that there is no dogma greater than the idea that government can do absolutely nothing. And that is the position of the government and of the Liberal Party. People are sick and tired of that. They want can-do government. They want solutions. They're tired of the notion of economic Darwinism that says we throw consumers to the wolves. They want solutions, and they want government to take a leadership role. That's why we propose public auto insurance. An auto insurance plan that works in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and in British Columbia, delivering the lowest and fairest auto insurance premiums to the consumers of those provinces. And the Leader of the Liberal Party is wrong when he says you can't use Manitoba and Saskatchewan as a model. Of course you can, Madam Speaker, and it just demonstrates his lack of understanding of the system. It's too bad he hadn't taken me up on the tickets to go to Manitoba and actually see their system in action. He would be far better off for it, let me tell you. I can tell you something, Madam Speaker. What we have here is a proposal that we put forward that was supported by the Consumers Association of Canada, that was supported by the Coalition Against No Fault, Madam Speaker. It was supported by organizations that don't kowtow to the industry, that don't support the insurance industry and their shareholders in Europe and the United States, but care about the interest of families, consumers, and their families right here in Nova Scotia. Right here in Nova Scotia, that's who we care about. And, Madam Speaker, as always, the only thing that stands between the people of Nova Scotia and lower and fairer auto insurance premiums are the two parties that sat in this legislature beside us. That is what stands between the people of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, this may as well have been called an act to amend the laws rather than called an act to amend the laws respecting auto insurance. It should have been called an act to serve the best interests of the insurance industry. It is a response to the industry and the industry only, and not a response to the interests of consumers. In a nutshell, it takes yet more money out of the pockets of consumers, specifically those who are unfortunate enough to have had an injury, and it gives that money to the insurance companies. Now, the minister who drafted the act and the regulation says that he wants to be fair. Well, Madam Speaker, this is fairness with a vengeance, Madam Speaker. It is about a piece of legislation that strips the right to sue for very serious injury, and I suppose, to be fair, limits it to a very small amount of money, what I would consider to be a token amount of money. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second. Any injury, no matter how serious, that has no downstream effects will not be compensated on the basis of the facts of the case. For example, you could, as the Leader of the Liberal Party said, be in a coma and recover, and as long as you recover, you get $2,500. $2,500. Now, I'm going to say more about this later because there is a point that I wanted to make, and that is at this point, which is that this is simply an unwarranted restriction on the civil rights of the people of our province. The right to seek proper redress before an independent court based on the individual's facts. So let's begin by ignoring the rhetoric of the government and their partners on the Liberal benches and the insurance industry and look at the substance of the bill and alternatives. Now, over the summer, the Premier and the Minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance rates and the leader of the Liberal Party and their candidates all complained bitterly about the prospect of public auto insurance, and they said this is the setup of unnecessary bureaucracy. This is going to be an expense to the government. So what are they going to do? So what are they going to do instead? They're going to set up the Insurance Review Board, a bureaucracy that's going to have a chairman, a vice chairman, 7 other members. It's going to have an executive director. It's going to have all the trappings of their office. We have no idea what it's going to cost. No idea what it's going to cost. So I'm going to ask the minister responsible to release what the salaries of the chairman, of the vice chairman, of the executive director, what their salaries are going to be, because I'm sure that the minister responsible for skyrocketing auto insurance rates wouldn't be adverse to releasing what startup costs are going to be. I can't imagine that he would be adverse to that, because after all, that's what he called for. And no matter how many times we told him exactly what it was going to cost, they refused to believe it. Madam Speaker, the other point, incidentally, is that all of those costs are going to be piled right back onto the back of the consumers. Because whatever you charge the insurance companies, where are they going to go get it? They're going to go right back to the consumers to get it. So that's the first point that ought to be made. Now, I can't help to think that it would be, I mean, the insurance companies and the government must be, patting each other on the back and chuckling, if they're not laughing out loud, about the way that they have managed to manipulate this situation to the best interests of the government and of the industry. Because now they're going to set up this board with the chairman and vice chairman and the members who are all going to be appointments from the government. And we know, given what their record has been over the past number of years, exactly where those people are going to come from. And they're not going to go through the human resources, the Human Resources Committee, like the other agency boards and commissions, because they, and even when they did, Madam Speaker, even when they did put appointments through the Human Resources Committee, they would only show you who their recommendation was, and they wouldn't even show you who applied for the positions. So we can well see where that one's coming. The worst that can happen to the insurers is that they lose some premiums for a year before they can apply for increases. That's the worst that can happen to them. And in the meantime, they rake in the benefits from the caps on soft tissue injuries. The government has now created a whole slew of ways for the industry to reap more money out of the policy itself. Now, I'm sure with respect to the bureaucracy, the minister will say that the bureaucracy is necessary in order to make the legislation effective. That will be, they have to have somebody in place to monitor it, right? Well, I think that you could divide that statement into 2 parts. First of all, when it comes to the question of injury compensation and the cap that's going to go on injuries, the $2,500, they're going to have absolutely no problem ensuring that happens. And you know why? Because the courts of the province are going to make sure it happens. Once the legislation is in place, the courts are going to look at it. They're going to look at the definition of a minor injury, and they're going to apply that standard, and they're going to tell people, you get $2,500 no matter how serious you are. That's what they're going to do. they're going to do it. That's the maximum amount that you're going to receive. So they're not going to have any problem making that effective. The problem, of course, is that the other part, the part of keeping insurance rates down, well, that's going to be much harder to make effective. And my bet, Madam Speaker, is they're going to be just as effective as the freeze was that they brought in last year, which was not effective at all. I want to give you an example of how this is going to work. The Act, for example, Madam Speaker, excludes the Facility Association. Under the terms of the bill, the Facility Association is not an insurer. Not an insurer as defined in the Act. So any one of the thousands of Nova Scotians that have been placed in facility will get no benefit whatsoever from this legislation. Some people, and the minister says, and he's right, some people will come out of facility because some of the discriminatory practices that put them in there will no longer exist. It is true. Some people will come out, but many, many, many will not. And all of those thousands of people will continue to see no benefit from this legislation. And in fact, they may see even higher rates as a result of this legislation. So in this case, of course, the risk classification process says that you can't use certain discriminatory practices, but you can use kind of reasonable risk classifications. And we still don't know what those are. And in fact, Madam Speaker, we don't get any disclosure of them. So we may never know what their reasonable risk classifications are. And those could well land even more people in the Facility Association. So the industry at first instance is going to get a crack at putting forward to this Insurance Review Board risk classification systems, and as long as they manage to avoid the minefields that are set out specifically, they're going to be able to set out those systems. We will have no idea what is in them. So in the first place, there will be a reduction of 20%. The minister is going to say you have to refile your rates at 20% lower than they were before. Now, I want to remind people that these are rates that have already gone up by 60 or 65%. So what they're essentially saying is that a 45% increase in rates are okay. But we'll roll them back 20, and then in July of next year, you can go marching right back to the review board and ask for an increase. Right back and ask for an increase. And as long as you can justify it on the basis of your financial statements, and let's face it, I mean, the government has a hard enough time keeping track of its own finances, they're not going to be able to go to see ING, a multinational financial services corporation headquartered in the Netherlands, and examine their books. They're going to have to rely on whatever it is that they file. And do you think for a second that they're going to file statements that says that they're going to make billions of dollars? You know, no way. They are going to flow through so many head office administrative expenses. You're never going to see anybody who made a profit on the insurance industry in this province. Never. And they're going to keep justifying increases after increases after increases in the rate of insurance, just as they have been doing over the last number of years. Now, the irony is that under Section 113D, and I think it's important to point out to you, Madam Speaker, that this goes directly to the principle of the bill, insurers will be entitled to provide coverage that is now available as part of your standard endorsement form. That's the way it works. You go, in fact, in Nova Scotia, you can go to any insurance broker, anywheres, and you buy the standard endorsement form, number 1, and it's the same for everybody. The leader of the Liberal Party's insurance is the same as mine. The Premier's insurance is the same. We all have the same insurance policy because it's mandated. You have to have it. You have to have it. What differs are the endorsements that you purchase. You can buy the SEF 44. In fact, I think most places it's mandatory now too, but there are a number of standard endorsement forms that you can buy, and it will change the amount that you pay. And of course, things like collision, things like comprehensive, depending on your car and model, and all of that changes. Liability is not elective. the amount is, but the same basic policy is not. That's right. So the standard endorsement form is exactly the same for everybody. Now you're going to have to choose. You're going to have to say, we're going to take one set of options or another set of options. So some people will be able to get exactly the same coverage they have today, except they're going to have to pay much more for it. They're not going to benefit from the rollback. In fact, their optional coverage is going to push the cost of their insurance up. Yeah, I did read the Act. You should read the Act. That's exactly what it says. It's exactly what it says. This is a license for the insurers to raise rates. But that is far from the end of the ways that people will be gouged. Now, I want to illustrate this principle by looking at what would be a typical accident, Madam Speaker. If you can imagine looking at this bill and saying, what would happen if there was an accident and we applied the principles that are in this bill? And let's say, just for the sake of argument, that there's disputed liability in it. Parties haven't decided what it is, but they're not going to concede liability. So who is at fault is an issue that may be before the courts, but the insurers in their way will go ahead and try to negotiate anyway. Now, the Section B, the first thing that will happen after the accident is, let's just say you've been in a job for 3 years. You've completed your vacation for that year. You're driving down the street. Somebody hits you. There's a dispute about who's at fault. Well, the first thing that's going to happen after you contact your employer and say that you can't come into work is you're going to have to decide whether or not you can afford to stay off of work. Because you're going to look at Section B. You're going to look at your Section B coverage. And you know what Section B is going to give you? No matter what your income is, actually, if your income was way too low, you could get 80% of your earnings. But basically, you're going to get $140 a week. $140 a week. Now, imagine if you were single, let alone a sole wage earner with a family. If you're single, you're going to get $140 a week on which to live, because that's what Section B says you're entitled to, right? So, does this legislation fix the idea that you get $140 a week in recovery for lost wages? No. It allows you to give more money to the insurance company and buy optional coverage to increase Section B. You know, if the purpose is to pull down the cost of insurance, I mean, this isn't going to do it. In fact, this is going to increase the cost of the insurance endorsement. So you're going to get $140 a week. You're going to get the coverages under the medical expenses section to cover things like physiotherapy and those sorts of things that you need in order to recover. But let's just say you've suffered a moderate sprain of your spine. So that you're completely incapacitated, maybe for weeks, maybe for months, and that the rehab is going to be long and slow, but your doctor says, I predict that you're going to have a complete recovery. I mean, you're going to be completely incapacitated. You can't go to your job. You can't pursue gainful employment. You can't rake the yard. You can't play with your kids. You can't participate in your family household. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the stuff of your life, the quality of your life has been altered, and maybe dramatically. But they predict that over the long term, you're going to have a complete recovery. Well, under this legislation, that's a minor injury. It's a minor injury. So you already know what your loss is. You already know what you're going to recover for pain and suffering. You're going to get $2,500. But let's look at the other provisions of the policy. The other thing that you're not allowed to recover is non-monetary loss, right? And let's just talk about what would be non-monetary loss in this situation. Well, maybe I've been at this place for 3 months, or for 3 years rather. Maybe I've been a good employee. Maybe the employer's been a good employer. They like what I'm doing. But after 2 or 3 weeks when I'm off work, the employer says to me, look, I just can't, I got to have somebody else. I can't wait for you to come back to work. You're going to be years, maybe, or months. But even if it's 3 months, I can't afford to wait. I got to hire somebody else, so I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go. I'm going to have to let you go. So the employer, and they may be very compassionate people, but the reality is they got to have an employee that comes to work every day, does the work that needs to be done, and they just say, I got to hire somebody else. So they go out and hire somebody else, and now you've lost your job. You've lost your job. So now what's your loss of earnings? Well, after you've lost your job, of course, you have no place to go for your earnings. So what are you entitled to recover? Well, a court might say, the scale we would use is the wrongful dismissal scale. So you've been there for 3 years. We'll give you a month for each year that you were there, so you can recover 3 months of your wages based on economic loss. The loss of your job, well, that's a non-monetary loss. We can't do anything about that because the legislation specifically restricts us from undertaking non-monetary loss. So this is a problem that they have. So now you're stuck in a position where you're going to receive under Section B the $140 a week. You're going to receive some limited amount for economic loss, for loss of wages. You're going to receive $2,500 for your pain and suffering. And you think, well, at least there's nothing more they can do to us. I mean, they've taken away my right to recover for my job loss. They've taken away the right for me to recover for my pain and suffering, the disruption to my life. They have not allowed me to even live at a reasonable rate because the Section B amounts are so low over the course of my injury. So there's nothing else that they can do. Well, that's not the case. There's still more ways that the government can put more money into the pockets of the insurers, because I'll tell you what they do now. What they do now in this legislation is they legislate what's known as a discount rate for the cost of future care. So if you're injured and the opinion is that you're going to recover, it's not going to impair your ability to do your job, but you're going to need care into the future, maybe physiotherapy or some other kind of care going on into the future, this is what the government's going to do. The government's going to say, we are going to discount the amount that you're able to receive by 3.5%. By 3.5%. Well, now, I want to say, first of all, that discount rates are not unusual. In fact, the courts do them already. And those of us who have practiced in the course of this province know that it's 2.5%, and that is in the Civil Procedure Act. And so, to this regard, Madam Speaker, I want to table a little illustration of what that 1% change will mean to the insurers and to the consumers, because the impact of the discount rate on the recovery of future pecuniary losses, care costs, is not insignificant. For example, a 30-year-old faced with 20 years of future care costs of $10,000. The discount rate, so that means $10,000 a year is what it's going to take in order to provide them with their care. At a 2.5% discount rate, the present value of supplying that care over their lifetime is $157,670. At 3.5%, the present value is $144,390, putting an additional $13,280 into the pockets of the insurance companies. Now, I want you to think about that. That means that if you need care going into the future, the government decides that they're going to amend the discount rate so that you are not going to get sufficient amount of money to actually pay for the care that you're going to need or receive in the years to come. They're going to do it by legislation. Now, the technicalities of how this is decided Madam Speaker, if you're interested, is simply this. When you get an award for future care, the court looks at a couple of factors. They look at, well, if we gave you the money today, you'd be able to invest it, and you'd receive interest on that over time, and you got to account for that because you can invest that money, and therefore you don't need to get quite as much today as you would otherwise if you didn't invest it. So they look at that, and they say, well, the average bond rate is somewhere in the vicinity of 5.5%. Well, KPMG in their study assumes that the other discounting factor is inflation. So from the 5.5%, they look at inflation and they say it's going to run at 2%. They come up with their discount amount of 3.5%. Well, that's unreasonable. That is an unreasonable calculation because inflation runs closer to 3%. The courts have had that experience, and that's why in the civil procedure rules they set out a 2.5% discount rate. The only reason to change it was if the government arbitrarily decided that this was a way to put more money into the pockets of insurance companies. Now, over the course of the debate on this and on the idea of caps, we've heard a lot of comparisons about no fault, and I think it is an illustration of the misunderstanding of this legislation as a comparison to no fault, because the members opposite may want to know this is not no fault. This is worse than no fault. And why is this worse than no fault? Well, this is worse than no fault because what it does is it simply caps the benefit that is available. And it doesn't give anything back to consumers on the other side of the equation, Madam Speaker. In a no-fault system, what happens is this. People give up their right to sue for pain and suffering. In return for that, in the no-fault system, people get compensated on both sides of the accident. So they don't ask who's at fault. If you're injured in a motor vehicle accident, you get paid. In our system, that's not what happens. In our system is simply this. If you hit me, you're at fault. Even if you're injured, I'm the only one who gets paid. You don't get paid. In a no-fault system, what is compensated for is the injury, not the cause. And I can tell you, no, because they're accidents, right? This is the theory. They're accidents. Nobody plans to have a car accident. I mean, how many times did I have people come into my office when I was practicing saying, I only looked away for a second. I only looked away for a second. They didn't plan to miss the stop sign and put their car in the middle of somebody else's. They didn't plan to be adjusting the radio and then ram into the back of somebody. They didn't plan that. It happened. That's why they're called accidents. And the theory of no fault went, well, you shouldn't economically impoverish someone simply because there was an accident. So in no fault, they take the benefits from one side of the accident and they distribute them on both. And that's why the notion that no fault in Manitoba or Saskatchewan or wherever is somehow cheaper is just simply false. And in fact, if you talk to the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation, they will tell you that they found no savings as a result of a change to no fault. And there are many people there who wish they could go back to the tort system, and they may well yet. And you might point out also that the change that Manitoba ran for years and years under the tort system, and it was the Tories who changed the tort system to the no-fault system, not the NDP. And I'm always amused by it because, since those systems have been brought in, there have been Liberal governments, there have been Tory governments in those provinces, and they kept public auto insurance. Why? They kept it because they provided the lowest and fairest rates anywhere in the country. And you only have to look to the Liberals in BC who came in and dogmatically said, as the Socreds did, said, we're going to get rid of public auto, it's a curse. They came in, they got into office, and they know what they say? I'm a believer. This is the best system, you know. So you want to talk about the dogmatism of the parties. It's not us that's being dogmatic. We're just simply recognizing the reality. So this is not a no-fault system. This is worse than no fault because it strips a fundamental civil liberty of individual, the right to have their case heard before an indicated adjudicator in the courts of our province. It strips that right from them, and it gives them absolutely nothing in return. What it does is it lays down, it rolls over for the benefit of the insurance companies, and that's all it does, and it is the plan that was put forward by the government and supported by the Liberals over the course of the election campaign. Now, what is the legislation going to do? What is it going to do when it's actually implemented? Well, I'll tell you what it's going to do. It's going to cut out some litigation, but it's going to move the litigation from the question of what it is, from the question of liability to the question of whether or not you can meet the threshold as a minor injury. You're going to see litigation around the question of what a serious impairment is, you know, or whatever other definitions that the Liberals eventually manage to wring out of the government, and that's going to happen, you know. But it is akin, Madam Speaker, to fighting over a dollar while the insurance companies are running off with millions. You know, it's a sideshow because they've already made the decision. They've already decided that that their best interests what is akin to what's in the best interest of the insurance industry. What's good for the insurance industry is good for the people of Nova Scotia. That might as well be the mantra of the Liberal Party and of the government, because that's the way they view the world. It's not their fault. You know, it's their nature. It's the old story about the scorpion on the back of the frog. The scorpion says to the frog, will you get me to the other side of the pond? And the frog says, well, you know, you might sting me and I would drown. And he said, well, why would I do that? Because I'm going to be on your back. If I did that, I would drown too. So the frog says, good point, get on my back. The frog gets out in the middle of the pond, and as it does, the scorpion stings him, and he's paralyzed in disbelief, and as he's sinking to his death, he says to the scorpion, well, why did you sting me? Now we're both going to die. The scorpion said, I can't help it. It's in my nature. It's in my nature. Well, that's exactly what the Liberals are like. That's exactly what the Tories are about. They don't care. They're dogmatically wed to the idea that government cannot answer anybody's problem, and they have to turn everything over to people who want to benefit at the expense of consumers and their families. They can't help it. It's just in their nature. So now, the reality is that all of this legislation, the bureaucracy, the difficulties that I've pointed out that's going to accrue to people who are injured in this province, all of this could have been avoided. Could have been avoided with a public insurance, auto insurance program that would bring lower rates, improved benefits, and interestingly enough, built an industry in this province, one that we could be proud of, one that would be based here, that would have a head office here, that wouldn't pay the salaries of executive directors in the Netherlands and in England and in the United States. We could have brought people home to Nova Scotia, people in the insurance industry that are working in other parts of the country, could have come here and had jobs here, could have put that money back into our own economy. We could have used the loss reserves to buy municipal bonds here that would have improved the lives of our own communities. But instead, the government and their supporters in the Liberal Party say, no, what we're going to do instead is turn this over to the industry so they can do what's in their best interests, regardless of what is in the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia. Now, the fervent hope of the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance and his friends in the Conservative Party, and the fervent hope of the Liberal leader and his caucus is that the insurance problem goes away. They hope that somehow, by a miracle, over the next year, the insurance companies decide, well, geez, we're getting a lot of heat in Nova Scotia because, you know, the NDP's really kicking up a fuss over this, so maybe we'll lower rates long enough to get past the next election. That's what they're really, really hoping. But my bet is this. My bet is that they're sadly mistaken, Madam Speaker, sadly mistaken. Because I expect that over the next couple of years, the Liberals and the Tories will do everything in their power to try and explain away their inaction. They will quibble over minor parts of the bill and say, only if we did it this way, people would be better off. But they won't be. They won't be. This is a seriously flawed, even to the extent that it tries to reorganize the Insurance Act to help people under Section B. And I have, you know, long before the insurance problem arose, I have been raising in this House the question of Section B benefits. Because Section B benefits hadn't been just unfair for the last year or for the last 2 years. When I came into this House in 1998, I said one of the things that we should be doing is amending the Insurance Act so that we can change the Section B benefits. And while I'm on that topic, Madam Speaker, I'd like to say this about something that the government did do. They took Section B out of the Act and they made it part of the regulations. This is something I very much agree with. And why? Because you shouldn't have to bring in a bill every time you want to change the benefits in Section B. They should be changed routinely, year after year, to reflect the economic realities of the province. That's what they should be. It should have been in regulations to start with. Never understood why it was in the legislation. So I agree with that. The problem, of course, is they don't actually increase the benefits. They only increase the benefits if you want to pay more, which is exactly the problem they're trying to address. So the reality is that there's very little in this bill, and I have said and will say again, this bill will gouge consumers. It's a sellout to the insurance industry. There is very little in it of merit. It is not what we would do, and I think that's clear. I mean, the leader of the Liberal Party understands it's not what we would do. The government minister responsible for insurance knows it's not what we would do. But as the member for Richmond pointed out the other day in his, well, I guess we could call it a speech, dissertation, as he pointed out, the parties that support the insurance industry hold the majority in this House. They ran on it. They got elected on it. And so therefore they have a right to pass legislation in this House. I don't disagree with that. So I want to tell the Premier and the Minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance rates that our intention is to hold the government responsible on its legislation. That's what we're here for. And our members are going to speak on the merit of the legislation and fulfill their role as the official opposition. We are going to take every opportunity to try and improve the bill, even though we disagree with it, because that's our responsibility. If that means supporting Liberal amendments in the amendment process, we'll do that. We'll put forward our own. We'll look for their support. We're going to argue about what it is necessary to make this bill better, even if we decide in the end to vote against it, because we'll be voting against a principle. And our responsibility is to make sure that what goes into the bill, even if we disagree with it, is the best that it can possibly be. So when that legislation takes effect, and so that when it takes effect, the effect it's going to have on the lives of the people of Nova Scotia is as positive as is possible in the circumstances. And that's what we're going to do. We are not going to stand here and do everything in our power to obfuscate and to deny the legitimacy of the government and of the third party, because the reality is, Madam Speaker, this legislation is inevitably going to pass. At some point in time, the bells are going to ring, people are going to come in here and take their places, and so long as the two parties that support the insurance industry support the bill, it will pass. So our job is to take our responsibility seriously and try and improve the product that comes out of this House And that's what we intend to do. So, Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to have joined in the debate on this bill today. I look forward to the law amendments process. I look forward to the further readings on this bill. I am sure that it is being monitored carefully outside of here, and I'm sure that the Insurance Bureau of Canada is monitoring all of this very carefully to make sure that the government and the Liberals do exactly what they want, and that the amendments that do come through are not too harsh on their interests. Madam Speaker, where it's going to fall in the end, we shall see.
Thank you. The honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and speak on this particular bill, Bill number 1, an act to amend the laws respecting automobile insurance. Madam Speaker, as our leader has indicated, we do have some concerns about this particular piece of legislation. We have concerns that certainly, if addressed, would certainly make it workable for the people of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, is it a perfect scenario? I don't think so. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, I hear members of the NDP caucus saying that's why they're here, to bring in public auto insurance. Unlike those who live in a world that believe that everything is in a utopian state because they advocate a particular policy position, that's not the way it works in Nova Scotia. We come with a tradition of strong history and commitment to the people of Nova Scotia from all different political parties. Madam Speaker, if we look at the history of this province, we have generated perhaps some of the best legislation that has ever been generated out of any jurisdiction in Canada. And I would suggest, Madam Speaker, that this public auto versus private auto insurance issue, because that's essentially what it's coming down to, is another test of the will of the people of Nova Scotia through their respective elected officials to meet the needs of the people of Nova Scotia, to meet the needs of the taxpayers, to meet the needs of the consumers, to meet those who have been injuriously affected by the actions of the insurance companies, those who have been negligent, those who have been cheating the system, those who respectfully deserve their fair share, commensurate with the injuries and the damages to their person, to their property, and indeed to their lives in general. But Madam Speaker, not to be repetitive, because my colleague from Richmond, and indeed the Liberal of our caucus, our leader of our caucus, has outlined some of the key points of concern that we have with this legislation. And I have no problem, Madam Speaker, supporting this legislation to go on to law amendments, to hear what the people of Nova Scotia have to say. Because, Madam Speaker, this is the only jurisdiction in Canada where any Nova Scotian can walk in off the street and make representation, whether they support the legislation, whether they oppose the legislation, whether they propose to make amendments, or what have you, Madam Speaker. And it is probably one of the most cherished rights that we have been provided through some of our forefathers, some of which we see here pictured on the wall, such as Joseph Howe. Madam Speaker, I believe that just by the mere presence of this legislation being on the order table, we are now bringing accountability into the process with all stakeholders, and most importantly, the insurance companies who may or may not be taking advantage of some very difficult situations. And I put that on the table, Madam Speaker, for the benefit of the leader of the Socialist Party. Because over the years, Madam Speaker, over the years, not once since that member has stood place in this legislature has he ever made representation before the Public Utilities and Review Board on behalf of the consumers of Nova Scotia. Not once. With the key points, not once, with the key points that he says are key to protecting consumers and keeping the rates down, has he ever gone before the Public Utilities and Review Board and made presentation on those vital issues. Why not? Why not? Because, Madam Speaker, at the 11th hour, when he knew that the Liberal caucus was going to make representation, he sent off one of his caucus colleagues, the member for Cape Breton Centre, to go in and make representation. But all the details weren't there, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, they were not there. All the vital information that the Leader of the Opposition so eloquently waxes here today was not present there to help the panel of the Utilities and Review Board to digest and absorb and consider the facts that were put forth. Why? Maybe he didn't want that. Maybe it wasn't politically popular. It's much easier to be a champion to everybody about everything all the time, and then to believe that you never make any mistakes. Because if you were to listen and believe what the leader of the Socialist Party said, then all Liberals and all Tories in this province are bad people. They're just evil people if you listen and buy into that type of psychology. Have you ever listened? You know, the resolution that was before the House yesterday. You know, condemn people we don't even know. You know, for what reason? We can take issue on the principle of certain issues, but you don't condemn people personally because you disagree with them. Certainly, Madam Speaker, I would expect that members of the NDP caucus should show the same respect as members of the other caucus would show respect to people. Just because you disagree with them, you don't have to consider them to be bad people, evil, and working in some kind of a diabolical plot to cheat the people of Nova Scotia out of their money. I don't believe that for a minute. Madam Speaker. During the election campaign, the leader of the Socialist Party said that we could reduce insurance rates because we could cut back the administration costs by anywhere from 30 to 50%. And all of a sudden, that wove into, we're going to reduce rates by 30 to 50% for every Nova Scotian. That's the message. Now, I would dare say I'd love to see the details of that presentation that he would sign on the dotted line saying that he would guarantee a 30 to 50% rate to every Nova Scotian. I'll table this, Madam Speaker.
Correct.
Absolutely. I would think that most Nova Scotians would have this. Perhaps if I could hold with it, Madam Speaker, until I'm finished my dissertation.
No.
Well, could I have at least a copy of it? Let a copy go, Madam Speaker. That is the rule of the House. No. We'll get a copy and bring back. It's a sensitive issue. No. She's partial to certain colors. Madam Speaker, a little levity doesn't hurt in here sometimes. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, where is the detail? Where is the detail that the leader of the NDP party can go around and tell every Nova Scotian that he is going to guarantee a minimum of 30% decrease in their insurance and perhaps a 50% decrease? Well, it certainly, Madam Speaker, it doesn't show up in their legislation. I've read the 5 lines in your legislation. Very short on detail, Madam Speaker. Very, very short. All the NDP caucus is proposing for this wonderful said document for public insurance, 5 lines, 5 lines. That's the essence of their document for public auto insurance. They're going to appoint a commissioner to come back to the legislature within 6 months with a proposal for the establishment. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee. Another waste of time. In other words, just as we've heard from the leader of the Socialist Party, he's trying to be on both sides of the issue at the same time. He doesn't want to ruffle too many feathers in the business community because he may lose some votes. He may lose, perhaps, some contributions to the NDP party. On the other hand, he has to be seen as being the champion of the downtrodden, the oppressed, the suppressed, the repressed, the compressed, you name it, and he's going to be on the side of the angels. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, there is no detail, there's no substance to what the NDP has proposed. And perhaps there never was any. Madam Speaker, it's just like the $2 million cost of setting up public auto insurance. Now, he has to be, and his caucus have to be the only people in Nova Scotia that believe that you can set up a province-wide insurance scheme for $2 million. I don't know what's in the air in that caucus room over there, but I'm telling you, it's not logic. It's not logic. The most conservative estimates, small c, are $100 million, and on the outside, somewhere upwards of $300 million. So where does he get the $2 million? Why hasn't he provided that detail to the people of Nova Scotia? Why? I'll suggest because it's not there, and he knows it's not there. And he's avoided that through his entire dissertation. He's avoided it in his legislation. Why? Because they know. You know, it sounds good. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Any reasoned individual would support public auto insurance if they knew clearly what the NDP were saying was what you could count on, what you could depend, what you could trust and believe to be true. If somebody were going to say, the member for Cape Breton West is going to get 50% of his insurance premiums back, why wouldn't I support it? You'd have to have rocks in your head not to. And that's the same for anybody. But you know why they don't get into detail? Because they know deep down it's not there. It's not there. You know, we talked about the tort system and the no-fault system. Well, we have a no-fault system here in Nova Scotia, the workers' compensation system. Well. Remember back in 1998 when I was Minister of Labour and we proposed to start helping the workers for Nova Scotia? The workers. Let's forget about industry, because the NDP, their lights will only come on if you say something about a certain segment of society, and the rest they don't want to hear. Well, at that time, there was an exemption in the Workers' Compensation Act for non-Nova Scotia firms. They did not have to pay workers' compensation premiums for Nova Scotia for up to 6 months after they came to Nova Scotia, either for a contract, let's say to refurbish Province House or build an office tower or whatever. And Nova Scotia firms had to do it within what, 3 working days? Well, who was the only party in Nova Scotia that refused to support that initiative? The NDP. We had construction workers across this province. We had carpenters, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, you name it, Mr. Speaker, across this province, who were protesting because they couldn't get to work on certain construction sites for firms that were coming from outside of Nova Scotia, because the non-Nova Scotia firms were bringing in their own construction workers. Why? Because it was cheaper for them to bid on these contracts, and the Nova Scotia firms couldn't compete. The unionized labor couldn't get on the jobs because the firms from outside were bringing in their organized labor. And what did the NDP say? Tough luck. We support the non-Nova Scotia firms. Check the contributions to the NDP in the last number of years.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Just want to remind the honourable member that the debate before the House at this time is Bill number 1, or was when I left, which is the government bill. So I'd ask the honourable member to bring his comments back to the general principle of Bill number 1, the automobile insurance bill, please. Thank you. The honourable member, Cape Breton West, has the floor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. The fact of the matter is, workers' compensation is a no-fault insurance scheme. It's essentially a parallel to what the NDP are proposing. And that's why I felt it was important to outline the necessity of the causes and effect relationships and the decisions that you make that will impact on the people of Nova Scotia, and whose loyalties are where and why. It's very important because this has a profound impact for the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, that's why you have to examine, the meat of what's happening behind the scenes here. That public insurance system, the WCB, was a classic example of where the Socialist Party let down the people of Nova Scotia. In much the same vein that they will let them down should they be able to run away with this scheme that they have here today. Mr. Speaker, what the NDP leader fails to mention is that in British Columbia we have the tort system. We have the tort system. That's correct. That's correct. But if the member for Hants East would like to start drawing parallels from one to the other, maybe we'll just keep going on that vein. Let's look at Saskatchewan. Let's pick the young farmer who was killed not more than a year or so ago, about 2 years ago. And just recently there was a court settlement. Now this young man, so the story goes, it's in either a Maclean's or Time magazine, just recent issue this year. I'll make it available for the honourable member for Dartmouth North. They're very, very captivated by the detail of my speech, as you can tell. Mr. Speaker, this young man was about to take over his parents' farming operation. It was a multi-million-dollar operation. And because his parents were getting near the retirement mode, or they wanted to turn their operation over, he was in the process of being groomed and trained and for the management and take over their farm operation. Everything was going to be essentially his operation. He had an unfortunate accident, very unfortunate. He was killed at an intersection. And through this public no-fault insurance system, do you know what the death benefits were for this young man's family? $10,000. That's the cap. That's the cap under the public system in Saskatchewan that this man's family was able to. So yes, they lost a family member. They lost a tremendous source of income. The whole family business started to evaporate after that. Is that what we want? Do we want to close the door on families like this? There are many Nova Scotians. There are many Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that would be caught in a very vulnerable state under a socialist plan. And the leader of the NDP, in talking with regards to Bill number 1, Mr. Speaker, talks about dogma. And he said sticking to the principles and the philosophies, because he's aligned the Tories and the NDP as essentially the same philosophy. Look at what the NDP philosophy stands for. Look at the principles of their party and their philosophical policy. Is to eliminate any and all forms of capitalism. That's it. It's in document form. Look in Saskatchewan, the very model that they hold up. They want to eradicate all forms of capitalism. They talk about it like a dirty word. Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax-Chebucto noted earlier today in the local news that the cost of Hurricane Juan would be somewhere in the vicinity of $100 million. Now, I don't know where he got the figures. Could be more, could be less, but I don't have, suppose, the special talents he does to be able to come up with those figures. But if we had a public insurance scheme, and we're just talking auto insurance now, what about home insurance? What about professional liability insurance? What about insurance on recreational vehicles, you know, ATVs, snowmobiles, what have you? What about insurance for volunteer fire departments? It goes on and on and on. For farmers, for truckers, for farmers, for fishermen. Mr. Speaker, this is the tip of the iceberg. Under that scheme, if they're talking no fault, then the government or the taxpayers of this province could very easily be on the hook for $100 million if the system wasn't up and running in sufficient form to be able to generate the contingency fees to be able to cushion the blow. Is that what the honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto is proposing? I don't know. But it all comes down to money at the end of the day. The people of Nova Scotia don't mind paying a fair rate for their insurance if they're going to get a reasonable amount of coverage to ensure that they will receive some protection, some benefits in the event of an accident. Automobile accident, whether they slide off the road and you know, with the, you know, because of bad road conditions, or somebody drives into them or what. But they do take offense to the fact that they feel like they're being gouged. And I think there are processes to ensure that accountability. This is part of it. And I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that the leader of the NDP had ample opportunity to bring all that minute detail before the Public Utilities and Review Board, in fact, before colleagues of this House in the last session, long before it seemed to spiral out of control. Maybe he just wanted to use this for political posturing. I don't know. I just don't know. Only he can answer that question. Mr. Speaker, there's such a thing as due diligence, and we all have a shared responsibility here, whether we're on the government side or the opposition side. So crackling from the corner certainly won't answer any of the problems. It won't address any of the problems that we have here in Nova Scotia. I know in my constituency, some of the major concerns people have are the deplorable road conditions. There have been, I would submit, as many accidents in the last year in my constituency because of poor road conditions than there were in the previous 10. Almost on a weekly basis, Mr. Speaker, I would get one, perhaps two calls of motorists calling in saying, look, I just wrecked the front end of my car because of bad potholes, or they may have ripped off their muffler, or some damage to their car, the drivetrain, or whatever. This is a regular occurrence these days. Has the government given any consideration to adopting that 10-year plan that they so famously claimed that was in the famous Tory Blue Book, Blue Book 1? Because, Mr. Speaker, had they did that, they wouldn't have had to put the same promise in Blue Book 2.
Order, please.
Now,
Order, please. I ask the honourable member again to bring his comments back to Bill number 1, just before the House, and obviously it's the principles of Bill number 1, which is the automobile insurance laws. Now, member Cape Breton West has the floor.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have better roads, to be less apt to be accidents, less insurance claims. That's as simple as we can make it. And if the government had did what it said it was going to do, then perhaps we may not have even been here today debating this very piece of legislation. In part, it's a major contributing factor. And anyone in rural Nova Scotia knows that the deplorable road conditions are having an impact on the insurance rates of this province. So, Mr. Speaker, that is a major concern. Mr. Speaker, there's perhaps considerable opportunity for the people of Nova Scotia to come before law amendments and make their concerns known. Earlier today, I had the occasion to speak with a fairly prominent business lady in my constituency, and I asked her, I said, how are things going with your insurance rates on your fleet of trucks? And she said, well, she said, not so good. She said, we just get hit with a 40% increase. Now, that's rather substantial. And anyone that's been in the trucking industry, even if you had just one tractor trailer, the cost, it's just insurmountable for some, because a gallon of diesel fuel at premium rate today would be about $3.09. Now, the cost of operating the truck is when you take in the mortgage payments, you take in insurance, you take in depreciation, repairs, you take in the cost of fuel, the licensing fuels going from one jurisdiction to the other. It doesn't take long to find that in many cases, the small private independent truckers in this province are indeed just barely keeping their head above water. And I'm sure that's the same in just about any industry in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, this particular piece of legislation has the potential to do something good. And I believe that. Is it going to be perfect? I don't believe so. Will it correct some of the errors and omissions of what's transpired over the last few years? I believe it will, if it's given the opportunity, particularly with the points that were made by our leader, the member for Halifax Citadel, and indeed my colleague from Richmond. But I think it would be ill-advised to suggest that we're going to be like an ostrich, bury our head in the sand and say, no, it's not what we want, and we're not going to deal with anything else. At least the leader of the NDP party acknowledged that there is some good to this particular piece of legislation, and that he will try and improve on it, unlike some of their previous tests on public legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I'm looking forward to the deliberations that will transpire at law amendments. I certainly want to underline in the strongest possible fashion the conditions of the roads in this province are having a major impact for the people of Nova Scotia. The damages to their vehicles, the insurance costs are a direct result of that, and the government has to bear a lot of the responsibility. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, it was important to outline the fact that it was a commitment of the government in the last two elections that this is what they were going to do. They didn't do it, and they've remained very secretive about what their 10-year plan is. Now they've downgraded it just to it's like going from a hurricane down to a light wind. You know, they've downgraded the importance of it from one policy paper to the next. But it is having a major impact for the people, the motorists in my constituency, and I would ask that the government also make note of that as well in the course of this particular piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax, Shabakto.
Well, Mr. Speaker, over the last year and a half, a lot of the public policy debate in this province has focused on the issue of increasing automobile insurance rates and what can be done about it. It indeed has been an issue on which all three parties have worked, but in different ways. Our suggestions, our analysis, our solutions have set us apart. That is our analyses and our solutions have set the three parties apart, distinguished them. But of course, it's not just in Nova Scotia that this has been an issue. We saw it as an election issue in New Brunswick. And of course, we saw the results of the election in New Brunswick. It's currently an election issue in Newfoundland. And as we speak, voters in Ontario are going to the polls today, and one of the issues that they've been wrestling with in the last month has been the issue of automobile insurance rates. Clearly, it wasn't the only issue. Clearly, it wasn't the only issue in the other two provinces. And clearly, it wasn't the only issue in our province. But it was an issue which has preoccupied all three parties and preoccupied very many members of the public over the last year and a half. And it has preoccupied members of the public for very good reasons. What we have in front of us now with Bill 1 from the newly elected minority government is their attempt at a solution. We also have in front of us, of course, Bill 4, which comes from our party, the official opposition, that sets out what is our view. There is no third bill in front of this House from the third party. In fact, of course, the bill that we have, Bill 1, that comes from a progressive Conservative minister responsible for insurance, is in reality, of course, a Liberal bill. It's not a Tory bill. And the reason it, of course, is not a progressive Conservative bill is that the position of the progressive Conservative government was articulated by the minister and his premier time and again over the last year and a half. And that position was that although they fervently hoped that there would be a reduction in the huge rates of increase that consumers have had to deal with, they intended to achieve that reduction by persuasion. They were not interested in mandatory legislation. They were not interested in bringing forward exactly the kind of bill that Bill number 1 is. That is to say, legislation that, on the face of it, requires the insurance companies to reduce by 20% the premiums. That, in fact, was the position of the Liberal Party. They used a different percentage. They talked about 15%, but they spoke about mandatory legislation. It was only late in the election campaign in Nova Scotia that the Premier spoke about the possibility of bringing in mandatory legislation. After the election, with the results that put his party in the position of having a minority, he was faced with a dilemma. Clearly, there was huge public pressure to do something effective about automobile insurance. What was he to do? Well, in a minority government where there are three parties, the instinct of the government will be to try to partner with one of the two parties that might have a position fairly close to its own. In this case, it was the Liberal Party. And in this case, the government essentially brought forward the kind of bill that the Liberals said that they would bring forward. And because I regard this as essentially a Liberal bill, I've been thinking, Mr. Speaker, about some of the Liberal legacy that is closely parallel to what it is that we're dealing with. Who can forget the P3 arrangements of the Liberal government with respect to schools? P3, we should recall, stands for public-private partnerships. But what a public-private partnership we see in Bill 1. Isn't it just another example of a public-private partnership? In this case, the public sector, through this House, is being asked to put into law the kind of legislation that the insurance companies themselves would have gone for if they had been the effective government of this province. That's quite a P3 arrangement. That's quite a public-private partnership. So this issue over the last year and a half has certainly set the three parties apart. Yet one of the parties, the government, has now moved to the position of the third party. It is our party that has maintained our position. Our position is the distinct position. Our position is the position that says that there is a better alternative. Our party is the party that says that there exists a different model. Our party is the party that says that Bill 1 won't work. We have said this time and again. We said it before the election, we said it during the election, and we're saying it now after the election. The kind of arrangements that are manifested in Bill 1 will not deliver to the consumers of Nova Scotia the kind of rate relief that they want and that they deserve and that they could have if the public system were adopted in this province. To take that language of P3, there are three other Ps that I think we could keep in mind when we turn our minds to the issue of automobile insurance. Their profits, premiums, and payouts. When we think about the insurance industry, those are the main financial components of that industry: profits, premiums, and payouts. Easy to remember, easy to focus on, and they lead to a striking difference of approach. Let's consider why it is that we even have Bill 1 in front of us at all. We have this bill because consumers have been complaining about the ever-increasing cost of buying what is a legislated, mandated product. Remember, this is not a purely optional product for the consumer. The use of some form of automobile is so pervasive in our society that virtually everyone has one. And what the law says is, if you're going to drive a car, if you're going to drive a truck, if you're going to drive any form of motorized vehicle, you must purchase insurance. It is a mandatory purchase. And there are penalties for driving a motor vehicle without insurance. Indeed, Bill 1 proposes to increase very severely the penalties for driving without insurance. But that's the core problem. The core problem is one that consumers have raised. They have been on the receiving end of the huge increase in premiums. That's the problem. And why, we then have to ask ourselves, has there been such a huge increase in premiums? The insurance companies, individually and through their representative collective body, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, have let us know that in their view, the reason they have been obliged, they say obliged, to increase premiums is because of the payouts. They don't mention, or they do only to complain about them, the third P, the profits. They're focusing on the payouts. The consumers are focusing on the premiums. And we have brought the attention of the public several times to that third P, the profits. We have to keep all three of these elements in mind. Because, to cut to the chase, in the view of our party, if one of those three elements of the finances of automobile insurance as a business has to change, then what should give is not the payouts, what should give is not the premiums, what has to give is the element of profits. That's why, if we are forced to do something about this, and I say forced because I think that's the right word, it's consumer-driven. The consumers have spoken, but these three parties in this House have heard them differently. But we are forced now to deal with it. And our solution says that where we have to come to grips with the financial interactions of this industry, we don't choose, as the government and the third party have done, to put profits ahead of the interests of the general public. That's the wrong policy choice. And that's what this bill is about. This bill is about making the wrong policy choice. This bill is about saying that given some kind of financial squeeze, we, the government, supported by the third party, are choosing to keep in place the existing system along with its profits for the privately owned companies, and we're going to do this by squeezing the customer through reducing the payouts. That's what this bill says. It's not hard to read. It's in fancy legal language. It's got lots of regulations that have been drafted and put in front of us, but that's what this bill says. This bill says profits come before the customers, that in the squeeze, we're going to squeeze the drivers, the public in Nova Scotia, and we're going to do it through limiting their payouts. Average citizens are not fooled by this. They know that's exactly what's going on. Mr. Speaker, I was struck particularly by a turn of phrase that I heard prior to the election, but during the last year when there was public debate, extensive public debate about automobile insurance. And it was a phrase that came from a representative of the Coalition Against No Fault. It was Susan Hanrahan in a public forum at Mount St. Vincent University. And she said, because she knew at that time what the New Brunswick model was and how likely it was that the Nova Scotia government would find the New Brunswick model attractive. And she said, the result is going to be that the deductible on your body is going to be bigger than the deductible on your car. And you know what? She's exactly right. She is exactly right. That's what $2,500 is. It means that the deductible on your body when you're injured is going to be bigger than the deductible on your car when it's injured. Is that fair? Is that what the public of Nova Scotia wants? I do not think so. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear, since it's come up in the remarks of other speakers, about what it is that the alternative is that has been put forward by our party. And that can be easily summed up in a phrase that is easily recalled. Nonprofit, no caps. I heard confusion in the remarks, I think particularly of the member from Cape Breton West, who suggested that public systems automatically mean no fault. That's not true. He was either explicit on that or certainly implied it, and I want no one at home to make that confusion, because that is not the position of this party. Our position is nonprofit, no caps. And no caps does not mean no fault. Caps is what Bill 1 is all about. That means a cap on the benefit that will be paid to the injured individual. And we're not talking here about caps on the benefits to be paid. In the case of property damage, we're talking about damage to your body, pain and suffering. That's what this is about, pain and suffering. That's where the cap is going to be. So I just want to reiterate that point. The system that we're proposing as the only effective alternative is one that is not a no-fault system. Non-profit, no caps. Now, let's get back to the basic question of why it is that the government has thought to bring forward this bill. It was forced to it because of consumer outrage, because consumers felt that they were being dealt with in an unfair fashion by insurance companies. Now, as we all know, various steps have been taken prior to Bill number 1. There was a lot of debate in this House. There was